Put your hands where I can see them. The command cut through the steady drizzle like a blade made of cold authority, and Naomi Brooks froze under the flickering streetlight, her breath catching somewhere between confusion and quiet disbelief as rain slid down the curve of her cheek and soaked into the sleeves of her oversized hoodie. The faint smell of fresh paint clinging to her fingers as if it had already decided her story for her. The red and blue lights behind Officer Ryan Cole pulsed against the wet asphalt, stretching his shadow long and distorted across the empty street, making him look taller, heavier, more certain than he actually was, while Naomi stood still, her sneakers half submerged in a shallow puddle that mirrored the chaos of flashing lights and blurred faces gathering at the edges of the sidewalk. Phones slowly rising, not out of urgency but curiosity, the kind that watches before it understands. You vandalized city property, Cole said, his voice calm in a way that didn't invite questions, only conclusions, and Naomi blinked once. Then again, her eyes briefly shifting, not to him, not to the crowd, but past his shoulder, toward the quiet intersection where a traffic camera blinked its small red into the night, steady and indifferent, like it had seen everything before and would see everything again. She didn't argue, didn't step back, didn't even wipe the paint from her hands. She just stood there, shoulders slightly hunched against the rain, listening as Cole took a step closer. Close enough for the metallic scent of his badge and the damp fabric of his uniform to mix with the air around her. Close enough that the space between them felt less like distance and more like a decision already made. Turn around, he added, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, the hum of distant traffic fading, the quiet drip of water from a nearby awning echoing louder than it should. And Naomi slowly did as she was told, her movements deliberate, almost careful, like she was handling something fragile that no one else could see, her fingers spreading slightly as she raised her hands, the streaks of blue paint catching the light in uneven patterns that didn't quite match the accusation hanging over her. Somewhere behind her, someone whispered, "Did she really do it?" But no one answered, because the scene had already begun to write itself in their minds. Neat and simple, the kind of story that fits easily into headlines and disappears just as fast. Cole moved around her, his boots splashing lightly through the water, his gaze scanning her like he was looking for confirmation rather than truth, and when he stopped in front of her again, there was a flicker, just a flicker, of something unreadable in Naomi's expression, not fear, not anger, something quieter, steadier, like she was already a few steps ahead in a conversation he hadn't realized they were having. "You understand what happens next, right?" he said, and she met his eyes for the first time, really met them, her voice soft but clear enough to cut through the rain when she finally spoke. "Are you sure about this, officer?" And the question hung there, not as defiance, not as pleading, but as something heavier, something that didn't belong to the moment alone, something that made the air feel tighter, the light sharper, and the silence just a little too long. The question did not echo loudly. It settled into the space between them, quiet and deliberate, and for the first time since he stepped out of his patrol car, Officer Ryan Cole hesitated, not visibly enough for the crowd to notice, but just enough that his next breath came a fraction slower, his eyes narrowing as if recalibrating a situation that no longer felt as simple as it had 30 seconds ago. Rain continuing to tap against the pavement in a steady rhythm while Naomi Brooks held her position, her arms still raised, shoulders steady, gaze level, not challenging him, not avoiding him, simply present in a way that made it harder to reduce her to a headline. Cole let out a short exhale through his nose and shifted his stance, the radio on his shoulder crackling faintly with distant chatter that did not belong to this moment. Then he reached toward her hoodie pocket, movements controlled, practiced, almost routine, and yet there was a slight stiffness in his wrist as his fingers brushed against the damp fabric, like something inside him was aware of the eyes watching, the phones recording, the quiet tension stretching tighter with every second. "We are going to figure this out right now," he said, louder this time, for the benefit of the people behind the invisible line that had formed along the sidewalk, their faces half lit by screens and streetlight reflections. And Naomi did not respond immediately, her breathing slow, measured, her attention flicking once more toward the intersection behind him, that same small red light blinking steadily in the distance. unnoticed by everyone except her. Cole's hand disappeared briefly into her pocket, then emerged holding a small plastic bag, its contents smeared with the same blue paint that marked her fingers, and a murmur rippled through the crowd, subtle but unmistakable, the kind of sound that comes when uncertainty begins to lean toward judgment. There it is, Cole said, lifting the bag slightly, not high enough to display, but enough to confirm, his tone firm, almost final, as if the presence of the object alone sealed the story, and Naomi's eyes followed the movement, not with surprise, not even with frustration, but with a calm that felt out of place, like she had been expecting this exact moment. Long before he reached into her pocket, a man near the curb shifted his weight and whispered something under his breath. Another person adjusted their phone for a clearer angle, and somewhere in the background a car slowed, its headlights sweeping across the scene like a passing spotlight before moving on, leaving the street dimmer again, more intimate, more focused. You are going to need to turn around completely, Cole continued, his voice tightening just slightly, and Naomi did as instructed, her movements smooth, unhurried, the wet fabric of her hoodie clinging to her back as she pivoted, her sneakers making a soft sound against the soaked pavement, and when she faced away from him, her eyes briefly met the reflection in the puddle at her feet, distorted by ripples, fractured by light, but steady all the same. Cole stepped closer again, the distance between them closing until it felt almost scripted, his presence looming just behind her shoulder, and for a moment, the only sound was the rain, steady and patient, filling the silence that neither of them seemed willing to break too quickly. Then Naomi spoke again, her voice quieter now, but somehow carrying further than before. You should really check everything before you decide. And the words were simple, almost gentle, but they landed differently this time, not as a question, not as resistance, but as a statement that did not ask for permission to exist. Cole paused, just for a second, the plastic bag still in his hand, his gaze shifting briefly toward the ground, then back to her, then past her, scanning the street, as if searching for something he had not planned for, something that did not fit the sequence he had already set in motion. And in that brief scan, his eyes passed over the intersection, over the pole where the traffic camera blinked its quiet red signal into the night, and for a fraction of a second, something unreadable flickered across his expression before it disappeared beneath the practiced control he wore like a uniform. I have everything I need, he said finally, though his voice lacked the earlier certainty, and Naomi let out a slow breath, not in relief, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement, like she had just heard the final piece of a sentence she already knew the ending to, and she lowered her gaze slightly, not in submission, but in focus, her fingers curling just a little as the rain continued to wash over the paint on her skin, thinning it, softening its edges, carrying faint streaks of blue down toward the pavement where it dissolved into something less defined, less convincing. Behind them, the crowd leaned in just a little more, drawn not by noise or chaos, but by the strange stillness that had settled over the scene, the sense that something had shifted, even if no one could quite name it yet. And Naomi lifted her chin just enough to speak one more time, her voice steady, almost thoughtful. Then you will not mind checking the time. And this time, the silence that followed was not empty, it was waiting. The word time lingered in the air like a detail no one had thought to question until now. And Officer Ryan Cole's grip on the small plastic bag shifted almost imperceptibly, his thumb pressing slightly harder against the slick surface as if grounding himself in something tangible, something certain, while Naomi Brooks remained still in front of him, rain continuing to trace quiet lines down her sleeves, her hands still raised but no longer tense, her posture carrying a calm that did not match the situation unfolding around her. For a moment, Cole did not respond, his gaze narrowing as he studied her profile, searching for hesitation, for inconsistency, for anything that would confirm the version of events he had already decided upon. But there was nothing there except that same steady composure, that same quiet certainty that had begun to unsettle the rhythm of his control. What do you mean? Check the time, he said finally, his voice measured but thinner now, less anchored than before, and Naomi did not turn her head, did not lower her hands. She simply answered, her tone even, almost reflective. The time you said it happened, the time you found that. The time I was standing here. Each word placed carefully, not rushed, not forced. Like she was laying out something that had always been visible but never examined. A faint murmur passed through the small crowd, subtle but growing. People shifting slightly, adjusting their stance, their attention no longer fixed solely on the object in Cole's hand, but beginning to widen, to take in the edges of the scene. The details that had been ignored in the first rush of assumption. Cole's jaw tightened, and for a brief second, his eyes flicked again toward the intersection, toward the blinking red light of the traffic camera, and this time he did not look away as quickly, his gaze lingering just long enough to register its quiet persistence, its silent recording of everything that had passed through that stretch of road. The radio on his shoulder crackled again, a distant voice calling out a code that had nothing to do with this moment, and he reached up instinctively, pressing the button as if to respond. But he did not speak, his attention already pulled back to Naomi, to the question she had placed between them like a line that could not be easily crossed without consequence. "I saw you near the wall 10 minutes ago," he said, the words coming out firmer than he felt, as if repeating them could restore their weight. But Naomi's response came without delay, soft but precise. "You saw me walk past it, not touch it." And the distinction, small as it was, seemed to settle heavily into the space around them, the kind of detail that reshapes a story without raising its volume. A man in the crowd lowered his phone slightly, his brow furrowing, while another person stepped a little closer, not intruding, but listening more carefully now, as if the scene had shifted from something to watch into something to understand. Cole exhaled slowly, his shoulders squaring again, trying to reclaim the authority that had begun to slip, and he lifted the plastic bag once more, holding it at chest level. "This was in your pocket," he said, and Naomi nodded once, a small, almost acknowledging motion. "Yes," she replied, and for a split second, that agreement seemed to restore balance, to bring the narrative back into alignment, until she added, just as calmly, "After you checked it," and the words did not rise, did not accuse, they simply existed, and in doing so, they shifted the weight of the moment entirely. The rain continued its steady fall, tapping against metal, against pavement, against the surface of the puddles that now reflected both of them in fractured symmetry, and Cole's reflection wavered slightly as a ripple passed through the water, distorting his outline, breaking it apart before it settled again, and he glanced down briefly, as if drawn to it, before lifting his gaze back to her. "You were saying I put it there," he said, and there was something in his tone now that had not been there before, not anger, not even disbelief, but something closer to caution, as if he had stepped onto ground that did not feel as solid as it had moments ago. And Naomi did not rush to answer. She let the silence stretch just long enough for the question to echo in the minds of those listening. Then she said, quietly, "I am saying you should check everything." And this time, when she looked slightly to the side, it was not just a glance. It was a clear, intentional shift of attention toward the intersection, toward the camera that had been watching the entire time. The effect was subtle but immediate, a few heads in the crowd turning in the same direction, following her line of sight, their expressions changing not dramatically, but enough to signal that something had shifted, that the story they thought they were witnessing might not be complete. Cole remained still for a moment, the rain darkening the shoulders of his uniform, the sound of it filling the space where certainty had once been, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was lower, more controlled. "Dispatch," he said into his radio, pressing the button with a steadiness that took effort. "I need a timestamp on traffic cam at 5th and Mason, approximately 10 minutes prior." And as the static crackled in response, the street seemed to hold its breath once more, but this time, it was not waiting for confirmation, it was waiting for truth. The radio did not answer right away, only a stretch of static breaking in and out like a signal unsure of its own direction, and Officer Ryan Cole kept his finger pressed against the button a second longer than necessary before releasing it, his hand lowering slowly to his side, as if the motion itself required more thought now, more control, while Naomi Brooks remained exactly where she was, her arms still raised but no longer rigid, her shoulders relaxed just enough that the tension no longer belonged to her. The rain softened slightly, no longer a steady sheet but a lighter fall, individual drops tapping against the pavement in uneven rhythm, and somewhere behind the crowd a car passed at a distance, its tires hissing over wet asphalt, a reminder that the world beyond this moment had not stopped. Even if everything here felt suspended, stand by. The voice finally came through the radio, distant, official, detached, and Cole nodded once even though no one could see it, his gaze drifting again toward the intersection, toward that small red light that had not blinked differently. Not once, since this began. A few people in the crowd shifted closer, not stepping into the space, but narrowing the gap, drawn in by something quieter than spectacle, something that felt like a turning point they did not want to miss. Their phones still raised but steadier now, less reactive, more observant. Naomi lowered her hands slightly, not fully, just enough to ease the strain in her shoulders, and Cole did not correct her this time, did not repeat the command, his attention too divided between the voice in his ear and the silence in front of him. And for a brief moment, the authority that had defined his presence earlier seemed to thin, like a line drawn in chalk under steady rain. Timestamp shows subject passing through frame at 1942. The radio voice continued, crisp now, clearer. No visible contact with property at that time. And the words settled into the air with a weight that did not need emphasis, did not need interpretation, because their meaning was already unfolding in the expressions of the people listening, in the slight widening of eyes, the subtle lowering of phones, the quiet shift from assumption to awareness. Cole's jaw tightened again, but this time it was different, less about control and more about recalculation, his mind moving through the sequence of events with a precision that had always served him. But now each step felt less certain, less aligned with the outcome he had expected. Run it forward, he said into the radio, his voice steady but lower. And Naomi watched him without speaking, her gaze not confrontational, not triumphant, simply present, as if she had already stepped out of the version of the story that had tried to contain her. The rain continued to wash over her hands, the blue paint now faint, diluted, streaking away in thin lines that disappeared into the dark pavement, leaving behind skin that looked less like evidence and more like something ordinary again. At 1944, the voice returned. Officer approaches. Subject from north side of frame. And there was a pause, a small one, but noticeable, like the voice itself was adjusting. Interaction partially obstructed, angle limited, and Cole's eyes flickered, just briefly, toward Naomi, then away, his focus tightening, narrowing, as if he could will the next words into alignment with what he needed them to be. Continue, he said, and the crowd leaned in just slightly, the space between breaths growing thinner, anticipation no longer loud, but heavy. Naomi shifted her weight subtly, her sneaker pressing into the edge of the puddle, sending a small ripple outward, distorting the reflections again, and she glanced once more toward the intersection, not to confirm, not to check, but almost as if acknowledging something that had already done its job. At 1945, the radio voice said, slower now, more deliberate, subject appears stationary, officer within close proximity. Another pause, longer this time, the kind that carries more information than the words themselves. Possible object transfer not clearly visible due to obstruction. And the uncertainty in that sentence did not restore anything. It did not undo what had already been established. It only added another layer, another question that could not be easily dismissed. Cole exhaled, a controlled release of breath that did not quite steady him the way it once would have. And he lowered the plastic bag slightly, no longer holding it as proof, but as something that needed context, needed explanation. Naomi finally lowered her hands completely, letting them rest at her sides, her fingers flexing once as the last traces of paint washed away, and she looked at him directly now, her voice calm, almost gentle when she spoke. You said 10 minutes. And the simplicity of that statement cut through everything else, through the radio, through the rain, through the shifting attention of the crowd, because it pointed not to what could not be seen, but to what had already been heard, already been stated. Cole did not answer immediately, his eyes moving between her, the ground, the distant camera, as if each held a piece of something he was still trying to assemble into a version that made sense. And for the first time since the moment began, the scene no longer felt like something under his control. but something unfolding on its own terms, guided not by command, but by the quiet persistence of detail, of timing, of truth, that did not need to raise its voice to be heard. The silence after her words did not feel empty. It felt precise, like something had just been aligned in a way that could not be undone. And Officer Ryan Cole stood there for a moment with the plastic bag still in his hand, no longer lifted, no longer presented, just held, as if he had not yet decided what it meant anymore, while the faint hum of the radio lingered at his shoulder without speaking again, leaving the previous timestamps hanging in the air like markers that could not be moved. Naomi Brooks did not step forward, did not step back. She simply stood there with her hands now at her sides, fingers relaxed, the last traces of blue washed into the pavement beneath her, her breathing steady, her gaze level, and there was something in that stillness that shifted the entire weight of the moment away from accusation and toward something else, something quieter but far more difficult to control. A man near the front of the small crowd lowered his phone completely, his expression no longer curious but thoughtful, and another person beside him tilted their head slightly, eyes narrowing not in suspicion of Naomi, but in reconsideration of everything they had just watched unfold, and the space between people widened just a little, as if no one wanted to stand too close to a conclusion that was beginning to unravel. Cole finally moved, just a small motion, lowering his arm fully, so the plastic bag hung loosely at his side, his fingers no longer gripping it with certainty, but holding it like an unanswered question, and he cleared his throat, a subtle sound that did not command attention the way his voice had earlier, but still drew every eye back to him. Dispatch, he said again, pressing the button with deliberate care. Confirm sequence from 1941 through 1945, full playback, and his tone was controlled, but there was something underneath it now, something measured not by authority but by necessity, as if the request itself acknowledged that what had already been heard was not enough to hold the story together. Naomi shifted her weight slightly, the sole of her sneaker pressing against the damp asphalt, and she looked down for just a second, watching the last faint streaks of color disappear into the water at her feet, then lifted her gaze again, not toward Cole this time, but toward the camera at the intersection, that same small red light still blinking, unchanged, patient, as if it had never doubted its role in any of this. The radio crackled once more, louder this time, and the voice that came through carried a different tone, more attentive, more deliberate. Unit 12. Full playback indicates subject enters frame at 1941, continues walking eastbound. No contact with wall or surface. The words came steady, each one placing another piece into a structure that no longer supported the version Cole had presented. Officer enters frame at 1944, approaches subject from rear left. A pause followed, not long, but enough to shift the air again. Object appears in officer's right hand prior to contact. And that sentence did not echo, it settled, heavy and undeniable, spreading through the small crowd in a way that required no reaction to be understood. Cole did not move immediately, his posture remaining upright, his gaze fixed somewhere just past Naomi, as if he was looking at something no one else could see. And for a brief second, the sound of rain seemed louder again, filling the space that his voice had once occupied so easily, and the plastic bag in his hand now felt different, no longer evidence, no longer proof, just an object that had been seen, recorded, and placed into a sequence that could not be rearranged. Naomi did not speak. She did not need to. Her silence now carried more clarity than anything she could have said, and she let it remain, unbroken, allowing the truth to take its own shape without interruption. One of the bystanders took a slow step back, then another, as if the ground itself had shifted beneath them, and a quiet voice somewhere in the back whispered, "That is not what he said before." Not loud, not accusatory, just observed. And that observation moved through the group like a ripple, subtle but impossible to ignore. Cole finally inhaled deeply, his shoulders rising slightly before settling again, and he lowered his gaze to the ground for a brief moment. The reflection in the puddle no longer steady, broken by the continued fall of rain. Then he looked up, not at Naomi, not at the crowd, but toward the intersection, toward that blinking red light that had not changed, not once, since the moment began. The radio remained quiet now, its job done, its role complete, and in that quiet, The entire scene felt different, no longer driven by command, no longer shaped by assumption, but held in place by something far simpler and far more difficult to deny. The order of events, the passage of time, the quiet, persistent truth that had been there from the beginning, waiting not to be created, but to be noticed. The words from the radio did not fade. They settled, heavy and exact, and for a long second no one moved. Not Naomi Brooks, not the small cluster of people along the sidewalk, not even Officer Ryan Cole, who stood with the plastic bag hanging at his side like something that no longer belonged to him, his fingers loosening slightly as if the object had lost its weight the moment its story changed. The rain continued, softer now, almost a mist, brushing against faces and jackets and the surface of the street where reflections blurred and reformed with every drop, and Naomi's hands rested calmly at her sides, her shoulders no longer tight, her breathing even, as if the tension had passed through her and settled somewhere else entirely. Cole's gaze stayed fixed toward the intersection, toward that small blinking red light that had quietly recorded everything without judgment, without interruption, and there was a subtle shift in his posture, not a collapse, not a dramatic change, just a slight stillness that replaced the forward pressure he had carried before, like someone who had stepped too far onto a path and was now realizing there was no ground beneath the next step. A faint sound came from the crowd, not loud enough to be called a reaction, more like a shared exhale, the kind that happens when something unspoken becomes undeniable, and one bystander lowered their phone completely, slipping it into a pocket as if recording was no longer necessary now that the moment had already revealed itself. Naomi glanced down briefly at her hands, turning them slightly, the last thin traces of blue now gone, washed into nothing by the steady rain, and she rubbed her fingertips together once, more out of habit than need, before letting them fall still again, her attention returning not to Cole, but to the space in front of her, open and quiet. Unit 12. The radio crackled again, the voice more formal now, more precise. Additional units are en route to your location. And Cole blinked once, slowly, his jaw tightening just slightly before easing again, and he nodded to no one in particular, a small, almost automatic motion, as if acknowledging something that had already begun to move beyond his control. He finally looked at Naomi, really looked at her this time, not as a subject, not as a situation, but as a person standing in front of him. And for a brief second there was something in his expression that had not been there before, something quieter, less certain, like the realization of a detail that could not be undone once seen. Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, her eyes steady, not hardened, not soft, simply present, and she did not speak, did not fill the space with explanation or accusation. She let the silence hold, let it carry everything that had already been said and everything that no longer needed to be. Cole shifted his weight slightly, the wet pavement pressing under his boots, and he lifted the plastic bag again, not to present it, not to claim it, but to look at it more closely, turning it just enough for the faint streaks of paint inside to catch the light, and in that small movement, it was no longer evidence, it was context, something placed within a sequence that no longer supported the conclusion he had reached earlier. The sound of an approaching vehicle grew faintly in the distance, tires moving through wet streets, steady and inevitable, and a few heads in the crowd turned toward the source, then back again, their attention no longer scattered but focused, grounded in the unfolding clarity of the moment. Naomi took a slow breath, the cool air filling her lungs, and for the first time since the encounter began, she stepped forward, just one small step, not toward Cole, not away from him, but into a space that no longer felt confined, her movement calm, unhurried, like someone reclaiming ground that had always been hers. Cole noticed the movement, but did not stop her, did not raise his voice, did not issue another command, and that absence carried more weight than any order he had given before, the shift from control to stillness marking a line that could not be crossed back over. The red and blue lights from his patrol car continued to pulse behind him, reflecting off the wet street, but they no longer dominated the scene the way they had at the beginning, their sharp colors softened by the rain, by the quiet, by the presence of something more enduring than authority or assumption. Naomi's gaze drifted once more toward the traffic camera, that steady red blink still marking time, and she held it there for a moment, not as confirmation, not as validation, but as acknowledgement, like recognizing a witness that had done its job without ever needing to speak. The vehicle sound grew closer now, more distinct, and Cole lowered the plastic bag again, his hand relaxing at his side, and for a moment he closed his eyes briefly, just a fraction of a second, before opening them again, his expression composed but altered, shaped now by something that had not been part of his plan. Naomi remained where she was, her posture upright, her presence quiet but undeniable, and as the scene settled into this new stillness, it became clear that nothing loud had changed, no sudden movement, no raised voices, and yet everything had shifted. The story rewritten not by force, but by timing, by detail, by the simple, persistent truth that had been there from the very beginning, waiting to be seen. The sound of the approaching vehicle grew louder, tires rolling slowly over the rain-slick street until a second set of headlights cut through the dim glow, washing over the scene in a softer, steadier light that did not flash or pulse. And as the car came to a controlled stop a few yards behind the patrol unit, the atmosphere shifted again, not abruptly, but with a quiet finality that settled into every corner of the moment. Officer Ryan Cole did not turn immediately, his posture still facing Naomi Brooks, but his awareness had already shifted, his shoulders tightening just slightly as if preparing for something he could not yet fully define. While Naomi remained still, her presence calm, her breathing even, her gaze no longer fixed on him but drifting briefly toward the arriving vehicle, then back to the space in front of her, as if she had already stepped beyond the center of what was unfolding. The doors of the second car opened with soft, deliberate clicks, and two figures stepped out, their movements unhurried, measured, not drawn by urgency, but by procedure, and the faint reflection of their silhouettes stretched across the wet pavement, elongated and steady, as they approached without raising their voices, without interrupting the silence that had already begun to say more than words could. The crowd shifted again, not backward, not forward, but into a different kind of stillness. The earlier curiosity replaced by something quieter, more attentive, as if they understood that whatever came next would not be loud, would not be dramatic, but would carry weight all the same. Cole finally turned, just enough to acknowledge the presence behind him, his eyes meeting the approaching officers for a brief second before returning to Naomi. And in that glance, there was something unspoken, something that had not existed at the beginning of the encounter, something closer to recognition than control. Naomi watched the exchange without expression, not detached, not distant, simply grounded, her posture steady, her hands resting naturally at her sides, and the rain continued to fall lightly around her, no longer washing anything away, just settling, like the scene itself. One of the arriving officers stepped slightly ahead, stopping at a respectful distance, his gaze moving from Cole to Naomi, and then briefly to the plastic bag in Cole's hand, taking in the elements without rushing to interpret them, while the other officer remained just behind, speaking quietly into a radio of his own, his voice low enough that it blended into the ambient sound of rain and distant traffic. "We received the update," the first officer said, his tone even, not accusatory, not defensive, simply acknowledging what had already been set into motion, and Cole nodded once. A small, controlled motion, though his hand lowered further, the plastic bag now hanging loosely at his side, as if its presence no longer required explanation. Naomi shifted her weight again, just slightly, her sneaker pressing against the damp surface, and she looked down for a brief moment before lifting her gaze once more, her eyes steady, her expression unchanged, and she did not speak, did not offer anything more than what had already been revealed, as if she understood that the moment no longer belonged to her voice. The first officer glanced toward the intersection, following the invisible line that had been drawn by Naomi's earlier words, and though the camera itself remained distant, its presence felt closer now, more defined, like a silent witness that had already spoken through the fragments relayed over the radio. Cole inhaled slowly, the sound almost lost beneath the light rainfall, and for a second he looked as though he might say something, might reclaim some part of the narrative, but the words did not come, or perhaps they no longer fit, and he simply stood there, the weight of the moment, settling not on his shoulders, but somewhere deeper, somewhere quieter. A faint breeze moved through the street, carrying the scent of wet pavement and distant traffic, and Naomi lifted her chin slightly, not in defiance, not in triumph, but in a simple act of presence, as if she was no longer responding to the situation but existing beyond it. The second officer finished speaking into his radio and stepped forward, positioning himself beside the first, and for a brief moment, all three stood there in a line that felt less like authority and more like acknowledgement. The structure of the situation no longer defined by command but by clarity. The red and blue lights from Cole's patrol car continued to flash behind them, but they seemed dimmer now, less central, their urgency softened by the steady presence of something that did not need to signal itself to be understood. Naomi took another slow breath, her shoulders rising and falling gently, and she glanced once more toward the blinking red light at the intersection, holding that gaze for just a moment longer this time, as if recognizing that the truth had not arrived suddenly, had not been forced into existence, but had simply been there all along, waiting for the moment when someone would finally choose to see it. And in that quiet, rain-soaked street, with the sound of distant tires and the soft hum of radios in the background, the balance of the entire encounter had shifted completely, not through confrontation, not through volume, but through the steady, undeniable presence of something far simpler, the order of time, the consistency of detail, and the calm, unshaken certainty of a girl who had never needed to raise her voice to be heard. The air no longer felt charged with accusation. It felt measured, almost deliberate, as if every movement now carried consequence beyond the moment itself, and the two newly arrived officers stood in quiet assessment, their presence not overwhelming but stabilizing, like a line drawn not to divide, but to define what had already become clear. Officer Ryan Cole shifted his stance slightly, the wet pavement pressing against the soles of his boots, and for the first time since the encounter began, his shoulders did not lean forward, they settled back, the subtle change marking a transition from action to awareness, from certainty to something far more restrained. Naomi Brooks remained still, her posture relaxed but upright, her hands resting naturally at her sides, fingers no longer tense, and her gaze moved once from the officers to the distant intersection, that steady red blink continuing its quiet rhythm. A small detail that now seemed to hold more weight than any spoken claim. One of the arriving officers stepped a half-pace closer, his eyes moving carefully between Cole and Naomi, then down to the plastic bag still held loosely in Cole's hand. And there was no rush in his movement, no urgency in his tone when he finally spoke, only a calm precision that matched the gravity of what had already been established. "We are going to need to secure that." And the request was simple, not forceful, not confrontational, just necessary. Cole did not resist, did not question. He extended his hand slowly, offering the bag forward, and in that motion, something shifted completely. The object no longer an extension of his authority, but something separate, something to be examined rather than asserted, and the officer accepted it with equal care, holding it up briefly to the ambient light before lowering it again, as if confirming its presence without assigning it meaning just yet. Naomi watched this exchange without speaking, her expression steady, and for a moment her eyes softened, not in relief, not in satisfaction, but in recognition, like someone watching a process unfold exactly as it should have from the beginning. The second officer finished his quiet communication and stepped forward, his gaze moving across the small crowd, then back to Naomi, offering a brief nod that carried no words but acknowledged her presence, her role in the moment, and then his attention returned to Cole, who now stood with empty hands, the absence itself more telling than anything he had held before. "We will review everything in full," the first officer said, his tone even, his words directed toward Cole but audible to everyone, and the statement did not escalate the situation, it grounded it, placing the next steps firmly within a process that did not rely on assumption. Cole nodded once, a small motion, his gaze lowering briefly to the pavement where the rain continued to blur the reflections of lights and figures, and when he looked up again, his expression had shifted, not dramatically, not outwardly, but enough that the edge of certainty was gone, replaced by something quieter, something that did not resist what had already been revealed. Naomi took a slow breath, her shoulders rising and falling gently, and she shifted her weight again, this time stepping back just slightly, not retreating, not distancing herself, but creating space, as if recognizing that the center of the moment had moved away from her and towards something larger, something that no longer required her to stand at its core. A faint murmur passed through the crowd, not loud enough to disrupt the scene, but present, the sound of understanding replacing the earlier tension, and one bystander glanced toward another, their expressions no longer questioning Naomi, but reconsidering everything that had led to this point. The rain continued to fall in soft, steady drops, tapping against jackets, against the surface of the street. And Naomi glanced down once more at her hands, turning them slightly. Clean now, free of the color that had once been used to define her in this moment. And she let them rest again, her fingers still, her presence grounded. The first officer turned slightly, positioning himself between Cole and Naomi, not as a barrier, but as a point of transition, and his voice remained calm when he spoke again. We are going to proceed from here. And though the words were simple, they carried a quiet finality, a recognition that the situation had moved beyond its original frame. Cole remained where he was, his posture composed but altered, his attention no longer fixed on Naomi, but on the unfolding process around him. And for a brief moment, he glanced toward the intersection, toward that blinking red light, and there was something in that look that suggested understanding, not of the moment alone, but of how it had been seen, recorded, and ultimately revealed. Naomi lifted her gaze one last time toward that same point, her expression calm, and she held it there for just a second longer before letting her eyes return forward, her posture steady, her presence quiet but undeniable. And as the scene settled into this new phase, it became clear that nothing had been forced, nothing had been raised beyond control, and yet everything had changed, not through confrontation, but through the simple, unshaken alignment of time, detail, and truth that had been there all along, waiting for someone to see it clearly. The rain had settled into a fine mist now, barely audible against the pavement, yet somehow louder in the silence that followed the officer's words. And Naomi Brooks stood just outside the center of it all, no longer the focus of scrutiny, but still the quiet anchor of the moment, her posture steady, her breathing even, her presence unchanged despite everything that had shifted around her. The two officers who had arrived moved with calm precision, not hurried, not hesitant, their actions guided by procedure rather than pressure, and one of them turned slightly toward the patrol car, speaking softly into his radio again, his voice low and controlled, as if ensuring that every next step aligned with what had already been confirmed. Officer Ryan Cole remained still, his hands now empty, his shoulders no longer squared forward but relaxed in a way that did not suggest ease, only acknowledgement, and he glanced once more at the space where Naomi had been standing moments earlier, as if trying to reconcile the difference between the version of events he had constructed and the one that now existed plainly in front of him. Naomi took another small step back, not retreating, simply allowing distance to form naturally, her sneakers making a soft sound against the damp street, and she let her gaze drift briefly across the faces in the crowd, not searching for validation, not seeking reaction, just observing. And what she saw was not the same curiosity from before. It was quieter now, more reflective, the kind of attention that lingers after understanding begins to take shape. A woman near the curb lowered her phone slowly, her expression thoughtful, and a man beside her shook his head slightly, not in disbelief, but in recognition of something that had become clear only after it was too late to ignore. The first officer turned back toward Cole, his voice calm but direct. "We will need your report to reflect the full sequence." And though the statement carried no accusation, it did not need one, its meaning resting in the clarity of what had already been heard. And Cole nodded once, his gaze lowering briefly before lifting again, his expression composed but changed, as if the certainty he had relied on earlier had been replaced by something heavier, something that required more than assertion to carry. Naomi remained quiet, her hands loosely at her sides, her fingers still, and she looked once more toward the intersection, toward the traffic camera that had silently marked every second. And there was no triumph in her expression, no sense of victory, only a calm acknowledgement that the truth had been there all along, waiting for someone to notice its shape. The second officer stepped slightly to the side, creating a clear line between Naomi and Cole, not as a separation, but as a recognition that the moment had moved beyond confrontation and into resolution, and the faint sound of another vehicle in the distance suggested that the situation was still unfolding, still being documented, still moving forward even as the tension dissolved. Cole inhaled slowly, the sound almost lost in the quiet air, and for a brief moment, he seemed as though he might speak, might try to reclaim some part of what had been lost, but the words did not come, or perhaps they no longer fit within the reality that had replaced the earlier narrative, and he simply stood there, his gaze no longer fixed on Naomi, but on the ground just ahead of him, where the reflections of light and shadow shifted with each drop of rain. Naomi shifted her weight once more, her posture relaxed, and she took a small step to the side, positioning herself just beyond the line of officers, not removed, not hidden, but no longer central, and that movement carried a quiet finality, like stepping out of a frame that no longer needed her to define it. The first officer glanced toward her briefly, offering a small nod, not formal, not exaggerated, just a simple acknowledgement, and Naomi returned it with the slightest inclination of her head, her expression unchanged, her presence steady. The crowd began to loosen, not dispersing completely, but shifting, the tight circle easing into something more open, more fluid, as the urgency that had drawn them in gave way to the understanding that the moment they had witnessed was no longer unfolding in uncertainty. The patrol car lights continued to flash behind them, but they no longer dominated the scene. Their colors softened by distance and rain, and Naomi took a slow breath, her shoulders rising and falling gently, as she looked once more toward the intersection, that steady red blink marking time without pause, without bias. And she held that gaze for a moment longer before turning slightly, her body angling away from the center of the street, her steps unhurried as she began to move, not escaping, not retreating, but simply continuing forward, leaving behind a moment that had tried to define her, but had instead revealed something far more enduring, the quiet, unshaken strength of truth that does not need to be raised, only seen. Naomi Brooks did not rush her steps as she moved away from the center of the street, her pace steady, measured, each footfall soft against the damp pavement, as if she understood that nothing about this moment required urgency anymore, and behind her the quiet structure of the scene continued to shift, not in volume, not in force, but in meaning. Officer Ryan Cole remained where he stood, his figure no longer the axis of control it had been minutes earlier, his shoulders slightly lowered, his gaze following Naomi for a brief second before drifting away, not out of avoidance, but as if he no longer had a place within her direction, and the absence of command in that silence carried more weight than any order he had given before. The two officers who had arrived continued their quiet coordination, one speaking into his radio in a low, steady tone, confirming details that no longer needed to be argued, while the other turned toward Cole with a calm but unmistakable presence, not confrontational, not aggressive, simply firm in a way that left no space for misinterpretation. "We are going to need you to step over here," the officer said, his voice even, and Cole nodded once, a small, controlled movement, and followed without resistance, his boots making a soft, muted sound against the wet street, each step slower than the last, as if the ground itself had become something he needed to feel carefully now. Naomi did not turn back immediately, her gaze forward, her posture unchanged, and she reached the edge of the sidewalk where the curb met the street, the faint reflection of the patrol lights stretching across the shallow water at her feet, and she paused there for just a moment, not because she was unsure, but because something in the air behind her had shifted enough to be felt, even without looking. The crowd had begun to disperse slightly, not all at once, not in a rush, but in small, quiet movements, people lowering their phones, slipping them into pockets, exchanging glances that carried more understanding than words, and the earlier tension that had held them in place had softened into something reflective, something that lingered even as they began to step away. Behind Naomi, Cole stood beside the two officers, his hands now at his sides, his posture composed but undeniably altered, and one of the officers spoke quietly to him, his tone measured, professional, the kind of voice that did not need to raise itself to be understood, while the other maintained a steady presence just a step away, creating a space that was no longer defined by authority, but by accountability. Naomi exhaled slowly, the cool air brushing against her face, and she finally turned her head just slightly, not fully, just enough to glance back over her shoulder, her eyes moving briefly across the scene, taking in the figures, the shifting crowd, the soft pulse of red and blue lights, and then settling for a fraction of a second on Cole. And there was no anger there, no triumph, only a quiet recognition of what had unfolded, of what had been revealed without force, without resistance. The rain continued to fall in a light, steady rhythm, and the traffic camera at the intersection blinked its small red light into the night, unchanged, constant, a silent witness that had already done its part, and Naomi's gaze lingered there for a moment, longer before she turned forward again, stepping fully onto the sidewalk, her movement smooth, unhurried, as if she was simply continuing a path that had never truly been interrupted. The sound of another vehicle approaching grew faintly in the distance, blending into the background of the city, and Naomi walked along the edge of the sidewalk, her shoulders relaxed, her hands at her sides, no longer carrying anything that needed to be explained or defended, and each step she took seemed to place more distance between her and the moment that had tried to define her, not erasing it, but leaving it behind as something completed, something understood. Behind her, the officers continued their quiet work, their voices low, their movements deliberate, and Cole remained within that space, no longer directing it, no longer shaping it, but existing within its outcome. His earlier certainty replaced by something far more still, something that did not resist what had already been made clear. Naomi's footsteps carried her further along the sidewalk, past the edge of the gathered crowd, past the reach of the flashing lights, and into a stretch of street where the rain softened even more, where the reflections blurred into something less defined, and she lifted her chin slightly as she walked, not in defiance, not in relief, but in a simple, quiet assertion of presence, of self, of something that had not changed despite everything that had been projected onto it. And as she continued forward, the scene behind her did not call her back, did not follow. It remained where it was, contained within the boundaries of its own unfolding, while she moved beyond it, carrying with her nothing but the steady, unshaken truth that had never needed to be raised, only recognized. And in that quiet continuation, the final shift became clear, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute, the moment. No longer belonging to accusation or defense, but to something far simpler, the quiet, undeniable balance of truth restored without a single word needing to be forced. The rain had thinned to a barely noticeable mist by the time Naomi Brooks reached the corner, her footsteps steady against the concrete as the glow of streetlights stretched long reflections ahead of her, and though the tension of the moment behind her had dissolved into procedure and quiet voices, something of it lingered in the air, not as weight, but as memory, as a shift that could not be reversed. She slowed just slightly as she approached the crosswalk, her eyes drifting toward the signal. Above, the red hand still lit, counting down in silent numbers that flickered against the damp metal casing. And for a brief moment she stood there, not because she needed to, but because the pause felt natural, like the end of one moment and the beginning of another. Behind her, the faint sound of radios and low conversation continued, distant now, no longer centered on her, and Naomi let out a slow breath, her shoulders rising and falling gently as the cool night air settled around her, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and asphalt, familiar and grounding. She glanced down at her hands again, turning them slightly under the streetlight, her skin clean now, free of any trace that had once tried to define her in a single glance, and she pressed her fingertips together lightly, as if confirming something for herself, something quiet and internal that did not need to be spoken. The crosswalk signal shifted, the red hand blinking before turning to white, and Naomi stepped forward without hesitation, her movement smooth, unhurried, her focus forward, not looking back, not needing to, because whatever had been behind her had already revealed itself fully. Halfway across the street, she slowed again, just slightly, her gaze lifting toward the intersection where the traffic camera still blinked its steady red light. Unchanged, constant, and she held that gaze for a moment longer this time, as if acknowledging not just what it had recorded, but what it had allowed to be seen, the quiet, undeniable sequence of truth that had not needed her to fight, only to stand. On the far side of the street, a small storefront cast a warm glow through its windows, the lights soft and steady against the darker tones of the night, and Naomi stepped onto the opposite sidewalk, the sound of her shoes shifting from wet pavement to dry concrete, a subtle change that marked a transition not just in space, but in the moment itself. She adjusted the sleeve of her hoodie slightly, pulling it down over her wrist, the fabric still damp, but no longer heavy, and she continued walking, her pace unchanged, her posture relaxed, her presence calm in a way that did not seek attention, did not ask for acknowledgement, but carried its own quiet certainty. Behind her, the street remained active, though the intensity had faded, the flashing lights less dominant, the voices lower, and Naomi knew without turning that the process would continue, that reports would be written, footage reviewed, conversations held in rooms far from this rain-soaked intersection, but none of that belonged to her now, not in the way it had moments before. She passed a bench along the sidewalk, its surface still glistening from the rain, and a faint breeze moved through the street, brushing lightly against her face, and she lifted her chin just slightly into it, her eyes steady, her expression unchanged, not because nothing had happened, but because what had happened no longer needed to be carried forward in the same way. A passing car slowed briefly at the intersection, its headlights sweeping across the pavement and catching her silhouette for a moment before continuing on, the light fading as quickly as it had come, leaving behind the steady glow of street lamps and storefronts. Naomi's steps remained consistent, each one measured, grounded, and as she moved further down the block, the sounds of the earlier scene faded almost completely, replaced by the quiet rhythm of the city at night. Distant traffic, the occasional hum of an engine, the soft whisper of wind moving through the space between buildings. She reached the edge of the next corner and paused again, not out of uncertainty, but out of habit, her gaze lifting briefly to check the signal. And as she stood there, still and composed, it became clear that nothing about her had changed in the way the moment might have tried to suggest. She was still herself, still grounded, still moving forward with the same quiet presence that had carried her through the entire encounter. And as the light shifted once more, she stepped forward again, continuing along the path ahead, leaving behind not just the scene, but the version of it that had tried to define her, carrying instead something far more enduring, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood, the quiet, unshaken truth that had never needed to rise above the noise, only to remain steady until the noise fell away. The city felt different a block away, quieter, not because the noise had disappeared, but because it no longer pressed in the same way, and Naomi Brooks walked beneath the soft glow of streetlights that cast long, steady lines across the sidewalk, her steps even, her pace unbroken, as if the rhythm of her movement had always belonged to her and nothing that had happened behind her had the power to disrupt it. A faint breeze moved through the narrow space between buildings, carrying the cool scent of rain and distant traffic, and she pulled her hoodie slightly closer around her shoulders, not out of discomfort, but out of habit, the fabric still damp but no longer heavy, no longer carrying the weight of anything placed upon it. She passed another storefront, its windows dim now, lights lowered, reflections of the street stretching across the glass in soft, distorted shapes. And for a brief moment, she caught her own reflection there, blurred by water and shadow, but unmistakably her, standing upright, moving forward, unchanged in the ways that mattered. Her gaze lingered on that reflection for just a second longer before she looked ahead again, her expression calm, her eyes steady, and there was something in that small moment, something quiet and certain, that marked the difference between what had been projected onto her and what remained true beneath it. Behind her, far enough now that the sounds barely reached, the earlier scene continued to unfold within its own boundaries, contained by process, by report, by the steady work of people who would now have to account for what had been seen, what had been recorded, what could not be reshaped by words alone. and Naomi did not need to witness it to understand that it would carry on without her, that the truth did not require her presence to remain intact. She reached another corner and slowed slightly, her eyes lifting to the traffic signal above. The numbers counting down in silent intervals, and she stood there for a moment, not impatient, not distracted, simply present, letting the pause exist without needing to fill it. A car rolled past slowly, its headlights sweeping across the pavement and briefly illuminating her face, catching the faint droplets of rain still clinging to her skin, and then it moved on, leaving the street in its softer, steadier light. Naomi glanced down once more at her hands, her fingers now dry, clean, free of anything that had tried to define her in that earlier moment, and she rubbed her thumb lightly against her palm, a small, almost unconscious gesture, as if confirming that nothing remained there but herself. The signal changed, and she stepped forward again, crossing the street with the same measured pace, her footsteps quiet against the concrete, each step carrying her further from the scene that had attempted to confine her, not erasing it, but placing it firmly behind her where it belonged. As she reached the opposite side, a soft glow from a nearby cafe spilled onto the sidewalk, warm and inviting against the cool tones of the night, and she paused for just a fraction of a second at the edge of that light, not entering, not turning away, simply standing at the boundary between shadow and warmth, as if recognizing the choice inherent in every step forward. She did not linger long, only enough to take a slow breath, to let the quiet settle fully, and then she continued walking, her path clear, her direction steady, her presence unchanged. Somewhere in the distance, a siren sounded briefly, then faded, blending into the background of the city, and Naomi did not react, did not turn, because that sound no longer belonged to her moment. It was simply part of the world continuing as it always had. Her steps carried her further down the block, past closed doors and dim windows, past the reflections of streetlights stretching across wet pavement, and with each step, the earlier scene became less immediate, less present, not forgotten, but placed into its proper distance, its proper context. She lifted her gaze slightly, looking ahead to the next intersection, the next stretch of sidewalk, and there was no hesitation in her movement, no pause that suggested doubt or uncertainty, only a quiet continuation, a steady forward motion that did not need to prove anything, did not need to reclaim anything, because nothing essential had ever been taken from her. And as she walked beneath the final stretch of streetlight on that block, the faint mist of rain settling gently around her, it became clear that what she carried with her was not the memory of accusation, not the echo of voices or flashing lights, but something far simpler and far more enduring, the quiet certainty of who she was, unchanged by the moment that had tried to define her, and strengthened not by confrontation, but by the steady, unshaken truth that had never needed to rise, only to remain. The street stretched ahead in quiet continuity, each step Naomi Brooks took carrying her further into a space that did not question her presence, did not measure her worth against assumption, and the soft glow of the final streetlight on the block settled over her shoulders like something steady and unintrusive, a light that did not demand attention, but simply existed, constant and calm. Her pace did not change, her posture remained relaxed, and there was no urgency in her movement, no need to rush beyond what had already passed, because nothing behind her was chasing, nothing was calling her back. The moment that had once tried to hold her had already closed in on itself, resolved not through force, but through the quiet alignment of truth. She passed beneath the light, and into a slightly darker stretch of sidewalk, where the reflections of the wet pavement softened into muted tones, and the faint sound of her footsteps blended with the distant hum of the city, a rhythm that felt familiar, grounding, unchanged. Naomi's gaze lifted slightly, not searching, not scanning, simply taking in the path ahead, the outline of buildings, the soft glow from windows still lit, the occasional passing car that moved through the night without pause. And in that forward focus there was something settled, something complete. She slowed just once more as she reached the next intersection, the crosswalk signal counting down in silent numbers. And she stood there, still and composed, not because she needed to stop, but because the pause itself felt like a closing, A final moment to let everything that had unfolded find its place. The faint mist of rain continued to fall, barely noticeable now, resting lightly against her skin and the fabric of her hoodie, and she exhaled slowly, the breath visible for just a second in the cool air before fading. And in that breath there was no tension left, no question, only a quiet release. Her hands rested at her sides, fingers relaxed, and she did not look down this time, did not check them again, because there was nothing left to confirm, nothing left to wash away. Everything that had been placed upon her had already been undone by something far simpler, far more enduring. Behind her, far beyond sight now, the scene continued within its own boundaries, reports being written, voices measured, decisions made within rooms where the rain could not reach. But Naomi was no longer part of that frame. Her presence no longer required for the truth to remain intact, because it had already been seen, already been recorded, already been understood. The signal changed, the light shifting, and she stepped forward again, crossing with the same steady rhythm. Her footsteps quiet, her movement unbroken, and as she reached the opposite side, she did not pause this time. She continued, her direction clear, her path uninterrupted. A warm light from a nearby apartment window spilled onto the sidewalk, catching the edge of her silhouette as she passed, outlining her form for just a moment before she moved beyond it. And there was something in that brief illumination that felt final, not as an ending, but as a quiet recognition of presence, of being seen without distortion, without assumption. Naomi's shoulders remained relaxed, her head level, and she walked on without looking back, not because she was avoiding the past, but because she had no need to return to it. Nothing behind her held unfinished weight, nothing required her to stand in it again. The city continued around her, unchanged, steady, carrying its own rhythm forward, and she moved within it as she always had, not defined by what had happened, not shaped by the moment that had tried to contain her, but simply herself, moving forward with the same quiet certainty that had carried her through every second of it. And as her figure grew smaller against the long stretch of sidewalk, blending into the soft lines of light and shadow, it became clear that the moment had not changed who she was. It had revealed it, not in a way that demanded attention, not in a way that raised her above anything else, but in the simplest way possible, by letting the truth stand on its own until everything else fell away. She did not fight for it. She did not chase it. She did not need to, because it had always been there, steady, patient, waiting to be seen. And as she disappeared into the quiet distance of the night, there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to say. Only the lasting presence of something that does not need to be loud to be powerful, the kind of truth that remains long after the noise has gone, the kind that moves forward quietly, just like she did.